Do you enjoy reading the Psalms? The book of Psalms is a wonder. We are so blessed, we really are, to have at our disposal this collection of 150 Psalms right in the middle of the Bible. And there is just so much to learn, so much to gain from reading the Psalms as we get to see God, as we get to learn how to pray, as we get an insight into the stresses and trials of different psalm writers, as we get to see Jesus prophesied in the Psalms, and even praying the Psalms. That's a great practice, to just find a psalm that we can just pray out aloud and express ourselves with a little bit of help, with a lot of help actually, from the person who wrote the psalm. The Psalms are spirit inspired, and the Psalms are a great blessing to us today. Now, there is some variation in the Psalms. It is helpful to notice this as we're reading the Psalms, and it makes it quite interesting. For example, I'll just put it this way: not all Psalms are 100% prayers. So if anyone says to you that, the book of Psalms is a book of prayers, that's not entirely correct, because not every Psalm is a prayer, but some Psalms are 100% prayers. And I'll give you an example. Psalm 5 is 100% prayer. David starts with, "Give ear to my words, O Lord, consider my groaning." So David is addressing God. He is praying to God. We could call this a prayer psalm. Then we go to Psalm 59. David starts with, "Deliver me from my enemies, O my God. Protect me from those who rise up against me." All 17 verses of the psalm are addressed to God. It's a pure prayer psalm. But not all psalms are like this. There are psalms that are not prayers. For example, Psalm 1 is not a prayer. "Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, nor stands in the seat of sinners." And he goes on to talk about the God-fearing person who is like a tree, and he yields fruit in its season. And then he finishes with, "The Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish." Psalm 1 isn't a prayer. It's more of an instructive psalm, and we need those as well. Another example is a psalm of Asaph, Psalm 50. That is not a prayer either. In fact, from verse 5 to the end, it's God speaking to people. And we may not notice that at first when we read the Psalms at a surface level, that they're actually sections where God is speaking, not the psalm writer speaking to God or even speaking to people, but God speaking to people through the psalm writer. And we find this in Psalm 50. There are also psalms that aren't prayers, where the psalm writer is calling people to worship, such as Psalm 150. Then there is another kind of psalm that is a combination, where part of the psalm is addressed to God, but also part of the psalm is not. For example, it may be the psalm writer speaking to people, and he alternates between speaking to God and speaking to people. Here's a few examples. Psalm 6, the psalmist David speaks to God. He starts with, "O Lord," but later on he speaks to people. He says, "Depart from me, all you workers of evil." So David's not praying there. He is praying when he's speaking to God, but then he switches to speaking to people who are hostile. And then in Psalm 40, David is talking about God. He says, "I waited patiently for the Lord." And then from verse 5 onwards, he talks to God. Another example is Asaph in Psalm 76. He's talking about God, that God's name is great in Israel. And then he praises God. And then he says to the people, "Make your vows to the Lord your God." So we find this in the Psalms. There is this variation of who's speaking and who are they speaking to. Does the psalm stop and then we have God interjecting and speaking to us? So it's important to notice this, and even for example, to print a psalm on an A4 page of paper and go through and divide the psalm into sections according to who's speaking and what's happening in the psalm at that point. So identifying these things is really helpful for us to get more out of the Psalms. And then if God's called you to a teaching ministry, if you're leading Bible studies or you're in preaching ministry, then it's helpful to us to see these differences so that we can preach and teach the Psalms better. What a goldmine the Psalms are. May God help us to go deeper and learn much from them.